Welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. Each week we feature an episode from the best independent creators. Hit subscribe for more great true crime content. If you would like to support Indie Drop-In and get these episodes ad-free, check out our Patreon at the bottom of the show notes. Today's episode is from True Crime Historian. Don't forget to check out the show notes for links to subscribe and follow on social media. Enjoy the show.
Begin. Popular.com.
April 28th, 1931. A girl from Maine who swapped rural gingham for synthetic silk and became a part of the metropolis's fast sisterhood of the cabarets was the victim yesterday of a roadside murder patterned after the slaying of Vivian Gordon. Tossed from an auto on Valentine Street, a lover's lane in the Dunwoody section of Yonkers, the body of the girl, identified as Virginia Brannon, 23, of Bangor, Maine, was found shortly after 10 a.m. yesterday. Like the slain vice witness Vivian Gordon, yesterday's murder victim was taken for her last ride after she had been wined and dined in mock chivalry by her assassins. The police last night were attempting to link the murder with gangland intrigue, but the quality of the girl's clothing contradicted the supposition that she was a gangster's moll. Seemingly, the little girl from Bangor had tried to live dangerously, as Vivian did, but she was not as successful in prolonging the experiment. Her body, garbed in the tawdry finery of the 10 cents a dance girls of the Broadway rumba rodeos, was discovered inside the wall of St. Joseph's Seminary. In her handbag, with keys, cosmetics, and minor trinkets, were found a group of speakeasy and cabaret cards, many of them believed garnered during the evening's round. Her girlfriend, Gertrude MacDonald, with whom she first came to New York, is believed to have been the weeping young woman who made the identification in company with Chief of Police Edward Quirk of Yonkers. Last night, Sidney Handler, special investigator attached to the office of Samuel Seabury, New York's vice and court investigator, went to the Havey Funeral Home in Yonkers where the body was taken to determine whether the dead girl was the red-haired girl who called at his office recently to tell of a frame-up by New York vice cops. Miss Brannon, who had plucked her eyebrows and otherwise achieved a synthetic beauty since her arrival in New York, had changed her dark brown locks to henna. Police early yesterday began questioning John Doyle, manager of the Primrose Dance Hall at 125th Street and 8th Avenue, one of the places where the girl is said to have worked. A search was made by detectives this morning at 383 East 136th Street, where Miss Brannon lived in the home of William Perrow. The blonde young woman believed to have been Miss MacDonald, who made the identification, took one look at the body in the Havey parlors and shrieked, "That's Virginia, that's her," and then burst into tears. The victim was garbed in a blue twill ensemble, gray stockings, and a cheap black satin coat trimmed with brown and white rabbit fur. A single bullet, which has not yet been found, of either .32 or .38 caliber, had been sped through her coat, perforating her left side just below the heart. It went through her body, coming out at a point in her back near the right kidney. One brown high-heeled pump encased the left foot. 5 hours after the discovery of the crime, at 10 a.m., the mate slipper was found 1.5 miles from the Bronx line, indicating it had been discarded by the murderers after they had disposed of the body. The missing shoe was found on Central Avenue, Yonkers, on the most direct route from that section of Westchester to New York. Police believe that the slain girl was shot by someone sitting in the front seat of the death car. Bruises on her forehead and body were not believed to have been caused by a beating, but rather to have resulted from the throwing of her prostrate form over the wall of St. Joseph's Seminary in Dunwoody from a car. Bruises on her forehead and body were not believed to have been caused by a beating, but rather to have resulted from the throwing of her prostrate form over the wall of St. Joseph's Seminary from a car. True Crime Historian presents An Eye for an Eye, a special edition of yesterday's news exploring the criminal justice system at its most extreme, inflicting the death penalty. Episode 412 is an action-packed adventure that begins with the body of a pretty girl on a dark, lonely road and includes a policeman killed in the line of duty, more than 1,000 shots fired in a showdown with the villains, a couple of attempted jailbreaks, and a double dose of lethal justice. Add in a broken-hearted mother and a mall who turns the tables, and see where it goes. The newspapers at the time compared this to a similar murder that had just taken place, the story of Vivian Gordon's last ride. It was the subject of True Crime Historian episode 228, and you can listen to it for free at www.patreon.com/truecrimehistorian. And I am True Crime Historian Richard O. Jones, and for your horror and indignation, I give you The Taxi Dancer's Death Ride, a Broadway Moth, her overweight date, and the Half-Pint Gangster. April 29th, 1931. A Brooklyn motorcycle cop and a youth who plays at being a big-shot gangster were being sought by police last night for questioning in the murder of Virginia Brannon, the shop-worn taxi dancer who was treated for a Last Supper and a death ride early last Monday. While Chief of Police Edward Quirk of Yonkers, where the body of the young, poorly dressed Broadway Moth from Maine was found, instituted a search for both men, he withheld their identities. Quote, both men were friendly with the young woman and met her at the Primrose Dance Hall, and the young tough may hold the solution of the murder. Unquote. Meanwhile, Quirk and District Attorney Frank Coyne of Westchester County questioned Henry Miller, Jr., Virginia's steady boyfriend. Miller said the slain young woman was in constant fear of a man who had threatened to get her, and that she called his home at 1626 Holden Avenue, Bronx, the day before her murder and said, I must see Henry at once. It's dreadfully important. I need him badly right now. I may not live if I don't see him. The parents of the young woman, who were en route from their home in Bangor to claim the body last night, had thought up to the time of her death that she was making goods on the stage here. Chief Quirk, commenting on this phase of the case, said he had found evidence that the girl had threatened to commit suicide several times and said that two fears were dominating her life. One was, she said, that her parents might discover she found dross instead of gold on Broadway. The other, that a man she feared would force her into a life of shame. April 30th, 1931. A flaming youth and his sweetie, who found murder in the ashes of the imitation big-shot revelry in which they indulged with 3 companions on Monday night, solved the murder of Virginia Brannon, Sheba of the 10 Cents a Dance Hall, yesterday in an open confession to a Catholic priest. They named Rudolph Derniger, an Ossining truck driver and pool-room cowboy, as the slayer, and the hunt was begun for both Derniger and Tommy Jordan, whom they accused as the driver of the car from which the Brannon girl was tossed into Lover's Lane, Yonkers. Earlier in the day, police found the car in which the pretty but poorly clad taxi dancer was taken for her last ride, abandoned on East 155th Street, Bronx. Previously, 4 members of the Manhattan Gun Squad had exchanged shots with 2 male occupants of the machine in a chase through Bronx streets. The mystery was solved when detectives Dominic Casso and William Mara of Morrisiana Station arrested Robert LeClaire and Mildred Moore, both 23, on a tip that they were with Virginia when she died. "Send for a priest and we'll tell all," the pair told their inquisitors in the Morrisiana Station, and Father Joseph McCafferty of the Church of the Resurrectionists was summoned. "Father, we're in bad," they told the priest, "and we want to tell everything in front of you," LeClaire said. Then he and the girl recited a story of picking the Brannon girl up at the Primrose Dance Hall, 125th Street and 8th Avenue, where she was employed at 3 a.m. Monday morning in a car with Derninger and a youth they knew as Tommy Jordan, who lived somewhere on 8th Avenue, New York. Tommy was driving, and LeClaire and the Moore girl occupied the front seat with him. Derninger and Virginia were in the rear seat, and shortly after Miss Brannon entered, she threw her arms around the Austining youth and said, "I love Rudy. He's the only man who ever gave me an even break." For several hours, all five made a round of Manhattan and Bronx speakeasies, the pair said, the Brannon girl seemingly rapturously happy and making playful love gestures to Derninger. After a time, they said, Derninger suggested a ride to Austining, and upon arriving in that city, more drinking and petting took place in the car, in which blankets stolen from the Austining hospital and a generous supply of liquor had been placed. "We all became beautifully plastered," the Moore girl said, "and Bob and I passed out. I remember coming to for a few minutes when Tommy started to drive back to town. The next thing I knew, I was awakened by 2 shots, and Bob was just coming out of his trance, too. Tommy was still driving, and Rudy had a gun in his hand. I looked at Joyce, as we called Virginia, and her dress was covered with blood, and she was sobbing. I remember she said, 'For God's sake, get me a doctor, I'm shot,' and then she slumped down in the seat. Everybody kind of sobered then, except Rudy, who looked wild. Bob and I wanted to get out, but the other 2 made us stay, and we kept riding until we got to the seminary pharmacy near St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers. It was a little after 8 a.m. then, and Bob and I got out and went and bought a soda, and Tommy and Rudy drove on with Joyce, who I think was still alive. About 15 minutes later, they came back without Joyce and picked us up and drove us to 176th Street and Jerome Avenue, the Bronx, where we got out. We were too scared to ask what they did with Joyce, and they never spoke a word to us all the way down. I know that Joyce was alive when they took her away from the drugstore, so they must have dumped her inside the seminary grounds while she was still dying. The pair, who were turned over to Chief of Police Edward Quirk of Yonkers, are held without bail as material witnesses, while a widespread police hunt is on for Jordan and Derninger. The latter, whose reason for slaying the girl is still a mystery to police, LeClaire and the Moore girl declaring that they recalled no argument, are being sought. Derninger, nephew of William Corwin, an Austining butcher, had been employed as a truckman by the trucking firm of Merritt and Hitchcock of Austining until Saturday when he was discharged. Little of the background is known, other than that no police record has been found and that he was a frequenter of the cheap dance halls of Manhattan and the Bronx. May 6, 1931. Francis Two Gun Crowley, maniacal murderer of Virginia Brannon, who is sought for 2 other shootings, shot and killed Patrolman Fred Hirsch of the Nassau County Police last night in a desperate effort to escape arrest after 2 policemen had cornered him in North Merrick, Long Island. The 2 county policemen, off duty and cruising the roads, found Crowley and a young woman in a Ford coupe parked on a dark and lonely stretch of road at Washington Avenue and Middlebrook Road, North Merrick. Hirsch ordered the couple out of the car and recognized Crowley, whose photograph he had in his pocket. When Crowley claimed another name, Hirsch said, "You look like Crowley to me. Let me see your driver's license." Crowley made as if to reach for his pocketbook, but snatched a pistol instead and fired 4 times point blank at the policeman. Hirsch fell mortally wounded and was dead before help came. At the first shot, Patrolman Albert Udis, Hirsch's companion, who had also alighted from the police car, dived into the protecting bushes and emptied his revolver at Crowley, but the murderer leaped into his car and sped away with the girl, apparently unhurt. Crowley made a clean getaway, but police found his headquarters on 231st Street, Laurelton, where he has had a room for several weeks. Mrs. Davis, his landlady, identified photographs of Crowley as those of her roomer. A cordon of police was thrown around the house to await his possible return. Crowley, police say, is one of the most desperate killers alive. Several months ago, he forced himself into the American Legion headquarters at Balmer Place and Morris Avenue, Bronx, and when ejected, shot 2 men. Weeks later, Detective Fred Shadle arrested him in an office in the Grand Central section. He took a pistol from Crowley, but the slayer had another with which he shot and seriously injured the detective. A week ago last Monday, Crowley, according to others on a wild automobile party, shot Virginia Brannon and threw her body into the bushes in the Dunwoody section of Yonkers. The next night, he engaged in a gun battle with police who chased his automobile for miles, only to have him escape. May 7th, 1931. The capture of Francis Two-Gun Crowley, undersized and youthful desperado who is sought for 2 murders and suspected of a third, was expected in Suffolk County, Long Island last night. While 18,000 cops carried his picture in their caps and were anxious to obey their orders to shoot to kill on sight, detectives lay in wait for the 20-year-old slayer of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch in a secluded spot near Southampton. They had information from pals of the weakened little murderer that he would go into hiding there with Rudolph Fat Derniger, who is sought with him for the murder of Virginia Branham. Meanwhile, no trace has been found of Helen Walsh, the 16-year-old Brooklyn sweetheart of Two-Gun, who sat beside him in a stolen Ford sedan when he shot Hirsch to death as the cop interrupted their rendezvous in a lonely lane in North Merrick, Long Island, early yesterday. There were found mute evidences in Crowley's car, found abandoned in Jamaica soon after the shooting, that the Walsh girl had met a fate similar to Miss Brannon's. There were a couple of slugs embedded in a front door of the car. There was blood on the seat where Miss Walsh had sat. Detectives said they were certain that the ruthless little criminal had slain his girlfriend to seal her lips, to remove by death a witness to the murder of Hirsch. Two-Gun Crowley was definitely charged with the murders of Miss Brannon and Hirsch by police department ballistics experts, who decided that the bullets that killed Hirsch in the Harlem dance hall bell had been fired from the same pistol. They also decided that the bullet that felled Detective Ferdinand Shadle at an Lexington Avenue office at 41st Street a month ago had been fired from Crowley's pistol. Shadle, who is still in critical condition, was shot down when he tried to arrest Crowley on a grand larceny charge. While state troopers, New York detectives, and Nassau County cops combined in a hunt for Crowley, 3 other sleuths took off in an airplane from Roosevelt Field yesterday afternoon. The plane flew to Southampton. Frank Crowley is a splendid young man, no matter what people say about him being a murderer. Thus was the runty little killer defended by Helen Walsh's mother, Mrs. Jeremiah Walsh, who runs a rooming house at 69 Nassau Street, Brooklyn. He is madly in love with my daughter. They have been sweethearts for 2 years. Why, he wouldn't harm a hair on her head. She is as safe with him as she would be in my arms. I don't believe he has killed her. He'll bring her home to me unharmed, scoffed the gray-haired elderly woman. I know he would rather die than to see anything happen to Helen. But the girl's father wasn't so certain. He was silent and seemed worried. He told District Attorney Edwards, "If that little rat has done anything to my girl, I'll kill him with my own hands. He didn't give Hirsch a chance. He won't give you one. So if you find him, let him have it before he gets you." Crowley, a small-time automobile thief, is a typical product of Volstead crime. Uneducated, a common laborer on those rare occasions when he works, he ran with gangsters and beer runners. An orphan, he was reared from infancy by Mrs. Rose Crowley and lived with her on 231st Street, Laurelton, Queens. A frail wisp of a youth with curly brown hair, cold blue eyes, and a scar across the bridge of his nose, Crowley weighs only 110 pounds and is 5 feet 3 inches tall. May 8th, 1931. After he had fought like a cornered rat for an hour against 300 policemen who used machine guns, riot rifles, tear gas bombs, and other armament of criminal warfare against him, Francis Two-Gun Crowley, 20-year-old Petters Lane cop killer, was dragged wounded from the top floor of a 5-story apartment house at 303 West 90th Street at 6 o'clock last night and taken to Bellevue Hospital. The 110-pound desperado had 3 bullets in him, but he failed to make good his boast to Speakeasy pals that, quote, "no cop will ever take me alive," unquote. With him when he was captured was Rudolph Fat Derniger, sought for 10 days for the murder of Virginia Branham and Helen Walsh, Two-Gun's sweetheart, the girl whose mother often said she was the best influence in his life. Crowley was unconscious when Derniger and the Walsh girl threw open the door of the apartment in which the trio had barricaded themselves. He was sprawled upon the floor, one of his .38 caliber pistols held limply in his hand. Taken to police headquarters, Derniger confessed that he was the man, and not Crowley, who had killed Virginia Branham. The battle began shortly after 5 p.m., when police headquarters received definite information that Crowley and his friends were in the apartment. 4 carloads of detectives hurried there. Cops from nearby precincts were rushed to the scene. Police emergency wagons and ambulances were called. Occupants of nearby apartments were notified to leave their homes lest they be injured by stray bullets. The block on 93rd Street between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive was roped off against passerby as the coppers methodically prepared for their siege to take the man who has been called the most dangerous criminal in New York. Police Commissioner Mulrooney arrived to direct the attack personally. With him was Inspector Henry Bruckman. Other high officials soon joined them. "Open the door, Crowley," a cop called. The boy desperado's answer was a fusillade of bullets through the wooden panel. The cop retreated. Soon, machine guns were mounted on roofs nearby. Police with tear gas bombs and others with hatchets and pikes climbed to the top of the building. They chopped holes in the roof, tearing the ceiling away from Crowley's retreat. Meanwhile, he and Derniger were sniping with their pistols from the window, taking pot shots at policemen on the street below. While the policemen below occupied the attention of Crowley and Derniger by returning their fire, Those on the roof above widened the opening in the ceiling. Then they began to toss in tear gas bombs. The room was filled with fumes. Crowley and Derniger staggered to the window for air. The girl thrust her blonde head out, too. "Help! Help!" the hysterical girl wailed. Crowley clutched her by her throat and hurled her backwards out of sight. "Get back, you damned little fool," those outside heard him snarl at his sweetheart. He fired another shot and flung the gun at the heads of his foes below. Eager to get at their quarry, 4 detectives crept up the stairs. Detective Johnny Broderick thrust himself against the door, but it didn't budge. Inside, Crowley heard the noise and anticipated the action. He answered by firing a stream of shots through the door. "Come out, Crowley," adjured Mulrooney, cupping his hands to his mouth, shouting his invitation to surrender from a building top across the way. "Come and get me, you the defiant little murderer shrieked back. Finally, the girl decided to surrender. She shouted through the gaping ceiling that they were coming out of their retreat. She added, "And for God's sakes don't shoot us, because we haven't any more ammunition." Crowley was the first to leave the apartment. He staggered into the hallway and fell flat on his face. After him came the 200-pound Derniger. The girl came last. When he flopped on the floor, one of them seized him, shook him to his feet, and snapped, "Listen, you little rat, if you try to pull a fast one, I'll kill you." "Oh, I ain't armed. Give me a break," the 110-pound criminal whined. As he pleaded, the suspicious cop ran his hands over Crowley's body. Fastened to his legs, just above the ankles, he found 2 loaded .38 caliber pistols. The girl clawed at the policeman and struggled fiercely when they seized her. One of them carried her kicking and screaming down the stairs. She was taken in a taxicab to police headquarters. They strapped Crowley to a stretcher and took him to Bellevue. Cops in cars rode beside the vehicle. Crowley had 3 bullet wounds in his body when he arrived at Bellevue Prison Ward. Weak from loss of blood, he cursed, in moments of consciousness, the cops who sat at his bedside. As Dr. Rachel Bebb, a house physician, made out his admission blank, Crowley, groggy from tear gas and faint from the loss of blood, looked up to a cop who stood guard beside him and joked, "What'd you fellas shoot me with, 22s?" Crowley also said that Derniger told him he had killed Miss Brannon. He rebuked his pal, he declared, by saying, "If you killed a woman, you're crazy." The tearful Walsh girl herself put the finger on Crowley for the murder of Patrolman Hirsch. If he tries to recant his confession, her sworn statement at police headquarters is enough to send him to the electric chair. "Sure he shot Hirsch," she said, "and the policeman didn't have a chance. He killed him because the cop recognized him. He knew he was caught. Hirsch said to him, 'Crowley, get him up, I know you.' He whipped out a gun and fired. Well, I don't know how many shots. I was scared stiff. Then he got out of the car and walked over to Hirsch's body. He took his pistol away from him and shoved it in his pocket. He said to me, 'Baby, that's the way to treat a cop. I guess I fixed him up all right, didn't I?' Then we drove away. He told me, 'You're staying with me, kid, see? And if you don't be careful, you're likely to get hurt. You know too much now.' I was scared to death of him ever since he killed Hirsch. I thought he'd kill me. But he always told Red I'd never murder a woman. Cops are my meat. I thought I was going to get killed in that flat when the shooting started. I wanted to get out, but I didn't know how. I hid under the furniture and everything. Those bullets were flying around the place. And then Crowley, kept laughing at me and saying, 'What the hell's the matter with you, kid? You're not scared, are you?' In the brawl, Patrolman John Liston threw a gas bomb into the face of Derniger so hard that he temporarily rendered Two-Gun Crowley's buddy unconscious. Mrs. Margaret Walsh, mother of Helen, collapsed at her home at 69 Nassau Street, Brooklyn, when word reached her that her daughter had been trapped in a gun battle with two men. More than 10,000 persons gathered in the area of the shooting fray while the cops were exchanging shots with Crowley and his pal. They were held back by traffic cops. Physicians at Bellevue Hospital spiked reports that Crowley had been critically wounded. He had a bullet in each leg, they said, and another in his left wrist. The tear gas fumes, however, had made him violently ill and taken all the fight out of him. Mulrooney and Chief Inspector John J. Sullivan were among those who waited in the hall for the trio to give themselves up. The commissioner's eyes were red-rimmed and wet from tear gas when he emerged from the place. Detective Johnny Broderick, the strong-arm man of the police force, had tried to crash the door. He staggered from the building and collapsed on the street. An ambulance surgeon revived him. There were more than 700 shots fired by police during the battle. 6 guns were found in the vacated apartment. Crowley and Derniger fired several hundred rounds of ammunition. Detective Thomas Burns, who had trailed Crowley and Derniger and the girl to the 90th Street flat, had rented an adjoining room in the place earlier yesterday. Crowley and Derniger apparently learned that he was there. Shortly before the siege began, one of them fired several shots through the wall into Burns's room, but the cops arrived before the 3 could make a getaway. As the sniveling youngster waited to go under the surgeon's knife at Bellevue Hospital, he confessed the killing of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch, Nassau County cop, who surprised him and Miss Walsh as they sat in a stolen car in a lonely lane near North Merrick, Long Island, Wednesday morning. "Sure, I killed Hirsch," he boasted. "I fired 16 shots at him. I killed that copper deader than hell, I did. When I shoot 'em, they die, buddy, and I poured enough hot lead into that guy to kill a dozen guys. Then I got out of the car to make sure he was dead. If he wasn't, I was going to finish the job. I swiped his pistol, too. It was one of the guns I used on you fellas today." At the same time, the 200-pound Derniger, whose speakeasy pals called him Tough Red, was weepingly admitting that he had murdered Virginia Brannon, Harlem taxi dancer, whose body was found in a Yonkers field 10 days ago. "I killed her with Crowley's gun," Derniger admitted. "I shot her because I was sore at her." May 9th, 1931. Francis Two-Gun Crowley, runty little 20-year-old killer of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch, can hardly wait until he dies in Sing Sing's electric chair for the murder of the Nassau County cop. Crowley, who stood off a siege by 300 policemen in an attempt to evade capture Thursday afternoon, wants to plead guilty. He has no defense. He doesn't want a lawyer. A jury can sentence him to die tomorrow, so far as he is concerned. After he was indicted for Hirsch's murder yesterday afternoon, the youthful killer told District Attorney Edwards at Mineola Hospital, "I know I'm going to burn, and I want to get it over with right away. What's the use of fooling around with a trial, a bunch of lawyers, and all that bunk? I'm poison to those guys who'll be on the jury. They'll give me the business for killing that cop if it's the last thing they ever do. I haven't a Chinaman's chance, not a prayer, of getting a break from them, so why should I kid myself?" Crowley, who weighs 110 pounds and is only 5 feet 3 inches tall, killed Hirsch when the policeman found him and his girl petting in a stolen car. Crowley has a marked inferiority complex, Edwards decided. The diminutive little murderer told him, Listen, I'm only a little fellow, and I've been kicked around all my life by a lot of guys who are bigger and tougher than I was. I got pretty sick of it, too. But when I've got a gun in my hand, I'm as big as the biggest cop, get me? And when I have my shooting irons, I'm not afraid of anybody, see? Crowley told how he killed Hirsch as he and the Walsh girl sat in a stolen car in Black Shirt Lane, North Merrick, Long Island, early Wednesday morning. After Hirsch recognized him and told him to throw up his hands, he fired point blank at the cop. Quote, "Then he was lying there on the ground and I couldn't stand to see the poor devil suffer. So I got out and fired 2 more shots into him so he'd die quicker." Patrolman Albert Udis, who was with Hirsch at the time, dove into the bushes, Crowley said. "You should have seen that cop run when I started pegging those shots." Edwards told Crowley he could not plead guilty, but that the courts would assign him free counsel to defend him. He shrugged his shoulders indifferently. He was asked by Edwards if he thought he would be able to stand trial a week from Monday. "Sooner than that if you want to speed things up," the little thug snapped. "Why stall around? Let's get this thing wound up in a hurry. That's the way I like to do things." His eyes shining brightly and his cheeks flushed as he regained strength after a night's sleep at Bellevue. Two Guns told Edwards he was hungry. "What do you want, a steak?" the prosecutor asked him. "No, this is Friday," he replied. "Give me some fish." Crowley repeated his avowals of love for Helen Walsh, the 16-year-old Brooklyn girl who was with him and Rudolph Red Derniger when they were captured. "She's a good kid," he sighed, "and she's just as good today as she was before I met her, if you get what I mean. It isn't her fault. But the dame did get me into this jam in a way," he continued earnestly. "I asked her last Christmas to marry me, but she wouldn't do it. She knew I was running around with a bunch of little no-accounts up in the Bronx. When Helen gave me that turn down, I hit the skids fast. I didn't care what happened. I started out to raise hell, and I did a swell job, didn't I?" He laughed. "Now, if Helen had married me then, things might have been different. I might have straightened out. I'd have had a responsibility with her to support. I might have gone back to my old job as a metal lather. That paid me $50 a week." Crowley's indifference left him as he suddenly sat up in bed, clutched at Edwards's arm, and pleaded, "Say, could you fix it for me to see Helen just once more? I don't care what happens after that. They can send me to the chair, and I won't open my kisser if you'll just let me see that girl before I go." An elderly woman, who said she was Crowley's foster mother, Mrs. Rose Crowley, tried to see him before he left Bellevue Hospital for Mineola in a heavily guarded ambulance. She was denied a glimpse of him and left the hospital a tearful and dejected figure. More than 2,000 school children and grown-ups crowded about the ambulance when Crowley was booked without leaving the vehicle at Mineola Police Headquarters. There were oohs and ahs as the curious ones crowded about, and the puny little murderer smirked and enjoyed his notorious role. Crowley willingly posed for photographers who called at the hospital. He enjoyed that too, and combed his hair and primped himself so he would appear at his best. While he was en route to Long Island, his pal Derniger was arraigned in the Bronx for the murder of Virginia Branham. The 200-pound Ossining expressman admitted he slew Miss Branham because she told him she loved another man. He killed her with Crowley's pistol, and the latter was in the car with them at the time, Derniger said. Edwards detained the tearful Walsh girl at Mineola. He will not indict her as an accessory to Hirsch's murder as he originally planned. Instead, he will use her to send her sweetheart to the chair. "I love him," she said of Crowley. "Yes, I know he's a murderer, but I love him, and I always will. He was gentle and kind to me." Crowley's criminal record was compiled by cops yesterday. A slum-born baby, he was given by his parents to the woman who is now his foster mother. She reared him on a baby farm. The identity and whereabouts of his parents are unknown. His education was sketchy. He had a smattering of public school training, but not much. 2 years ago, on May 3, 1929, he launched his criminal career with the theft of an auto in Queens. He repeated the offense on July 1st, October 24th, and November 16th of that year in the Bronx. Each time he was discharged, and once he told detectives, "I can't resist the temptation of swiping a car just for a ride." Last January, he figured in a shooting scrape when he tried to force his way into an American Legion dance hall in the Bronx. 2 men were wounded and he fled. He then wounded Detective George Shadle when the latter tried to arrest him in an office building at 309 Lexington Avenue on March 14th. A month later, he and Derniger were sought for a holdup on East 45th Street. They are also suspected in 7 other holdups in Queens and Manhattan. May 10th, 1931. Hysteria swept over 2 young killers yesterday. It changed Francis Two-Gun Crowley from a pint-sized braggart into a sniveling coward who was afraid to burn. It transformed Rudolf Derniger, his 220-pound pal, from a stolid, sullen hulk into a boastful slayer who wanted to talk about his deed. "They're going to kill me. They're going to bump me off, and I don't want to die," Crowley moaned as he buried his head in a pillow at Nassau County Hospital. Hard-boiled one minute and cringing the next, Crowley managed to exhibit an attitude of indifference when County Judge Lewis Smith and District Attorney Elvin Edwards came to his bedside to arraign him for the murder of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch. He asked to plead guilty, but was told that would be impossible in a case of first-degree murder. "Have you any money?" Judge Smith asked. "Nah." "Have you a lawyer?" "Nah." "Do you care what happens to you?" "Nah." But when he was told a policeman would be assigned to assist an attorney in gathering evidence for his defense, Crowley showed worry. "Keep that copper away from me, or he's liable to beat the law to it," he said. Crowley's 5 bullet wounds, all of them superficial, have nearly healed. He will be moved to a cell in Murderer's Row in the Nassau County Jail today to wait his trial a week from tomorrow. Edwards fears that the toy bad man will try to kill himself. His nerve is gone, the prosecutor admits. His finish in the electric chair is 100-to-1 shot, and the undersized cop killer's impulses will be suicidal, physicians have warned him. Guards will stand constantly at his cell door so that the state may not be cheated of its victim. His cell will be searched thrice daily. Other precautions will be taken to keep him alive until he can be executed. More than 1,000 police turned out for the funeral of Patrolman Hirsch, Crowley's victim, at Belmore yesterday. Police bands with muffled instruments played as the cortege headed for St. Barnabas the Apostle Church. 4 fire trucks, piled high with floral offerings, were in the procession. The church was packed to the doors. The policeman's widow and his 4 children sat in a front pew. Patrolman Peter Yodis, who was with Hirsch when Crowley killed him, was among the mourners. Yodis's shoulders shook, his sobs were heard through the auditorium, and finally, when he could bear his grief no longer, he left the church as the Reverend Francis J. Healy placed a hand on Hirsch's coffin and said, Greater love hath no man than this, he gave his life for a friend. Helen Walsh, whose testimony will send Crowley to the chair, was kept in hiding yesterday by Prosecutor Edwards. I plugged her because she wasn't going to have anything more to do with me, Derniger said in a written confession of the murder of Virginia Brannon, taxi dancer. Derniger's cold-blooded confession, which is in the hands of District Attorney McLaughlin, says, quote, "You guys had it all wrong about Crowley killing her. That was my job. Crowley was there all right. He was sitting in the front seat driving the car. Robert LeClaire was with him, and between them sat LeClaire's girl, Mildred Moore. Virginia and I were sitting in the back seat alone. I thought she was my girl when we left the Primrose Dance Hall where she worked. But finally, when we were back in the car, she told me she was through, that she wasn't going to have anything more to do with me. She said she was going to marry a guy up in the Bronx. I didn't say anything for about 10 minutes. I just sat there and thought. If I couldn't have her, nobody else could. That was what I finally decided. I would kill her first. I had one of Crowley's guns in my pocket. My hand felt it, and I decided I would kill her right there in the car. We were riding along Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. Ahead of us was the elevated, which we were going to pass under in about half a minute. I decided to kill her there. The noise of the trains would drown out the shot. Without Virginia's noticing it, I drew the gun and slipped it around until its muzzle pressed against her side. Just as the car passed under the elevated, a train roared over us. It was the ideal moment for a killing. Even Crowley didn't hear the shot above the train's noise. Virginia didn't let a peep out herself. She just slumped over against me, and her head rested on my shoulder. To keep any jaywalker from getting suspicious, I put my arm around her shoulders just like we were sweethearts again. With my other hand, I slipped the gun back into my pocket. We drove on for some time that way, and Virginia didn't make a single move. Finally, I felt her pulse. There wasn't any movement at all. I knew she was dead, and I called up to Crowley. "Virginia's dead," I said. "Drive someplace where I can unload her body." Crowley didn't look back. He just stepped on the gas and headed north. Finally, we came alongside the wall that surrounds St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, and he stopped the car there. With the coast clear, I got out and lifted Virginia out of the car. I carried her body over the wall and dropped it behind some bushes there. Then we drove back into town. May 26, 1931. Bored and indifferent, pint-sized Francis Two-Gun Crowley, lulled in a chair in a Mineola courtroom yesterday, gazed idly out of a window and chatted spasmodically with his guards while more than 50 talismen were questioned to provide 3 jurors for his murder trial. Tomorrow a double panel will be squeezed into the small room which yesterday failed to accommodate a fraction of the crowd that blocked traffic to catch a glimpse of Nassau County Patrolman Frederick Hirsch's diminutive slayer. So difficult did attorneys find the task of selecting a jury that it may be days before testimony starts. Necks craned, toes creaked, and the babble of the crowd swelled to a low roar as the 110-pound killer emerged from the underground passageway to enter the courtroom between a huge policeman and a gigantic deputy warden. A cheap new blue suit hung loosely on the shrunken frame of Two-Gun. It had been bought by the state to replace the bullet-torn, blood-stained garments in which police found him after storming an Upper West Side apartment a month ago. The blue tie and striped shirt were the state's too, but the unpolished shoes were his own. Women and girls, forming most of the crowd that occupied every square inch of space, gazed fixedly at the midget gunman. He couldn't be bothered. Perhaps he was thinking of slim brunette Helen Walsh, who was sitting upstairs in the district attorney's office, still vowing she'd testify for the state about the fatal petting party Patrolman Hirsch interrupted. May 28th, 1931. Soft-voiced Helen Walsh, as scared as she was when she hid in a closet while 300 police laid siege to Francis Crowley's 90th Street apartment, speeded the sawed-off cop killer toward the electric chair by her testimony in Mineola Courthouse yesterday. Under the tutelage of District Attorney Elvin N. Edwards, the 17-year-old gun moll made the damning statement that she never saw a gun in the hand of Patrolman Fred Hirsch before the sawed-off killer shot him down cold-bloodedly in Black Shirt Lane, a Petter's Haven in North Merrick, May 6th. But a few minutes later, as she was taken in hand for cross-examination by former District Attorney Charles R. Weeks, Crowley's lawyer, she broke under the killer's sardonic stare, asked for a glass of water, and seemed about to faint. She pulled herself together after shutting her eyes for a fleeting second, and then proceeded to pull some of the barbs out of her direct testimony. Question: You liked Frank a lot at one time, didn't you? Answer: Yes, I did. He said we'd become engaged Christmas. Question: You've changed a little since then? Answer: Yes, I gave him his ring back. It was a signet ring. Question: How much have you changed? Answer: A little bit. Question: Frank never made any advances to you even when he had you in the apartment, did he? Answer: No, he never tried to. He always treated me nice. Question: As a matter of fact, after Frank took you away after the shooting of Patrolman Hirsch, he asked you if you wanted to go home, didn't he? Answer: Yes, sir, he did, but I was scared. Question: You were so scared when the shooting in Black Shirt Lane occurred that you lay down on the floor of the car and couldn't see all the time whether Hirsch had his gun out? Answer: Yes, sir. Question: And you were scared on the day that Frank was seized in the 90th Street apartment? Answer: Yes, sir. Duringer and I hid behind a closet while Frank stood in the middle of the floor and shot the cops off. Although the demure gun moll, who was chicly garbed in a skipper blue coat with a gray fur collar, blue poke hat, and black pumps, told of meeting Billy Dunn, her rival for Crowley's affections, the morning after the murder, she did not tell of an incident which attended their meeting. Weeks, in his opening, in which he pleaded with the jury that his client was a moral imbecile with a mental age of 10 years, told it, however. Crowley, hounded as he was, sought to send the girl home, and then he took her to his apartment and did not harm her, but instead he introduced her to Billy Dunn and told Billy that Helen was a good girl. Helen sneered at this, and the impetuous Crowley punished her with a blow on the nose for the sneer. The Dunn girl, whose real name is Vera Woods, appeared in the courtroom garbed garishly in an evening gown and wisecracked on the proceedings. The other principal witnesses following the choosing of the last 2 jurors was Patrolman Peter Yotis, whom Crowley's counsel accused of deserting his partner. The patrolman, a husky rookie of 4 months on the Nassau County Force, told under direct examination at the opening of the afternoon session that he did not recognize Crowley when he approached the car in which he was parked with Helen, that neither he nor Hirsch drew a gun on the diminutive slayer. Yotis said he went into the bushes at the height of the shooting because he couldn't get his gun out. Under cross-examination, he became nervous. Question: Isn't it true that you ran away when you heard the shots? Answer: No, I didn't run. I backed away. Question: Didn't your partner call to you for help, and didn't you refuse to aid him? Answer: No, I did the best I could for him. I couldn't get my gun out in time, and I stayed in the bushes until I did. I didn't hear him yell for me. Question: What did he yell? Answer: He yelled, "Oh, oh, oh." This latter testimony was contradicted by the Walsh girl, who said that she heard Hirsch, as he slumped over Crowley's fire, yell something like, "Yodis, Yodis." A further point brought out in her cross-examination was the admission that Crowley told her, as they drove away, that he didn't fire until Hirsch had pressed his gun against Crowley's leg or stomach and clicked the trigger twice ineffectually. District Attorney Edwards, in his opening, demanded the electric chair for the 19-year-old slayer who snickered at the threat. He told the jury of 12 conservative small business and professional men, quote, "When the state has completed its evidence, it will have proved that Crowley deliberately and willfully emptied his automatic in the young patrolman, Fred Hirsch, knowing full well that Hirsch was a police officer. We will prove that Crowley, a fugitive from justice, killed the policeman in cold blood in order to escape. We ask a first-degree verdict and the electric chair." The Walsh girl was still held under surveillance by Edwards last night. Her whereabouts will remain a secret, attachés of the district attorney's office said, until the trial is over. Rudolph Fat Duringer, one-gun pal of two-gun Francis Crowley, went to court himself yesterday to fight against a trip to Sing Sing's death house for the killing of Virginia Brannon, 23-year-old dance hall hostess. Before adjournment, 10 jurors were selected. Duringer sat twisting a kerchief or drowsing between 2 deputy sheriffs as 58 talismen were called. District Attorney Charles B. McLaughlin, personally prosecuting, was principally interested in the attitude of the prospective jurors towards the death sentence, while former Magistrate Walter A. Lynch and Carl Pack, defense attorneys, sought jurors unprejudiced against gun-toters. They also indicated the line of defense would be an attempt to show Duringer was intoxicated and incapable of premeditating murder when he killed the 10-cents-a-dance girl. The courtroom was jammed before the trial opened, and 6 policemen under command of 2 lieutenants kept the corridor crowd in order. The Ossining New York truckman's mother and aunt, Mrs. William Cran, were in court, but were given no heed by Duringer. May 30th, 1931. Diminutive 103-pound Francis Two-Gun Crowley started for Sing Sing's electric chair in a blaze of riotous, dramatic action yesterday, action that turned the austere Nassau County courtroom into a screaming madhouse. 2 minutes after a jury had announced guilty of murder in the first degree, the cop-hating desperado was rolling on the marble floors of the courtroom and corridors. Police were aiming kicks and punches at his head and body, and screamed oaths echoed in the room where judicial comments had been uttered a brief moment before. For several minutes, an excited courtroom did not know whether Crowley, in a last bid for freedom, had snatched a gun from a policeman's holster, as he had threatened, or whether a high-strung police force had mistaken Crowley's attempt to kiss his foster mother as a bid for freedom. At all events, Crowley last night was laced in a straitjacket in a Mineola cell. On Monday, County Judge Lewis G. Smith will sentence him to die in Sing Sing's chair for the murder of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch on May 5th, when the Nassau officer interrupted Two-Gun's petting party with Helen Walsh on a lonely Manhasset byway. The mad outbreak in the courtroom came just after Crowley gave his pedigree. He had heard the verdict without batting an eye. The illegitimate child of an Austrian housemaid and a Manhattan private detective, coolly declared that he was 19, that he was born in New York City, that his parents were living. He was a Catholic, he declared. Then the clerk asked him about habits of temperance, and the gunman, who had been described as a moral imbecile, didn't know the meaning of the word temperance. It was explained to him. "I don't smoke or drink, if that's what you mean," he said. Then, shackled to Deputy Sheriff Frank Davis and crowded by a uniformed policeman, Crowley was swung around and started swiftly from the courtroom. In it was an extra guard of 10 policemen placed there by Inspector Harold King only 30 minutes earlier, when he learned that at lunch Crowley had boasted an intention to make a break. In the front row of spectators, his foster mother, the gray-haired, kindly-faced Mrs. Anna Crowley, smiled at him hopelessly. The desperado made a swift movement toward her to kiss her, as he declared later. A sudden yank by Deputy Sheriff Davis snapped the pint-sized killer back. Crowley, his right hand shackled to Davis, spun on his heel, and his left hand made a sudden thrust toward the deputy's holster. The guards leaped into action, and the battle started. Crowley cursed at the hated coppers, punched viciously with his free hand. His foster mother and foster sister screamed. The killer dropped to the floor, then he scrambled to his feet, and when the knot of struggling men reached the corridor, Crowley again went down fighting. After her first hysteria, Mrs. Crowley seemed resigned to the fate of her wayward foster son. She insisted, "It was those policemen again. It's always that way. They wouldn't let me kiss him." Over in the jail, Crowley growled sullenly, "Oh well, I'm glad it's over anyway." Neither Helen Walsh nor Billy Dunn, one the sweetheart and the other the girl in whose West End apartment he stood off the police siege, were in court when the jury announced the death verdict. It took them only 42 minutes and one ballot to decide Crowley's fate. Apparently, they brushed aside the issue of moral imbecility advanced by former prosecutor Charles R. Weeks, Crowley's attorney. In his summation, Weeks declared, "Society is on trial as well as this 19-year-old boy. This isn't the first time the sovereign state of New York has had a chance to save him. The state of New York had this boy in the children's court when he was hardly big enough to reason for himself, but the state did nothing to correct his criminal tendencies. Why should the state, which permitted him to become a criminal, demand his life in exchange for the life of Patrolman Hirsch? Are you going to say that this boy, with the mental age of 10, could on that night deliberate whether to shoot or not to shoot?" Unquote. District Attorney Alvin N. Edwards brandished Crowley as cruel, deliberate, and cold-blooded. He described the young bandit as a cop-hater and insisted that if the killer were permitted to live, he would always be of the same mind. Early in the evening, Crowley was released from the bonds that gripped him after the scuffle in the courtroom and was placed in the strongest part of the Nassau County Jail, the detention room. To escape, Crowley would have to force his way beyond the 2 policemen, open the door of the detention room, break through 2 more street doors, and pass through the jail office. The verdict apparently did not injure his excellent appetite. After being placed in the detention room, the slayer ordered a dinner of steak, potatoes, pie, and coffee. June 2nd, 1931. A daring attempt to cheat the law he hates, using an improvised knife in place of his beloved guns, was staged by Frank Two-Gun Crowley, the pint-sized cop killer, as he was billeted in Sing Sing yesterday to await the death chair during the week of July 5th. Smirking as he did when he attempted a movie thriller courtroom escape at Mineola on Friday, the bad boy who never grew up arrived at the Ossining Bastille shortly after 1 p.m., carefully guarded by Nassau deputy sheriffs and county police. He was handcuffed to 2 other prisoners in the back seat of a limousine. A few minutes later, he was within the grim confines of the death house. He was photographed, given the number 84567, and turned over to admission keepers for undressing. He began the process himself, for a reason discovered shortly, and was halted while keepers began stripping him preparatory to a bath. As the guards took his stockings off, a dagger made of a nickel spoon, worn sharp by rubbing, was uncovered, held fast against his ankle by the sock. It was 3 1/2 inches long, and the Sing Sing officials expressed belief it had been made by the 19-year-old killer during his stay in the Mineola jail, although how he managed to conceal it when searched upon leaving that institution remained a mystery. "What are you going to do with that?" he was asked. "You're pretty good at guessing. Guess," he responded, grinning. He took his bath docilely, allowed the guards to garb him in a white shirt, black trousers, and laceless moccasins, and then, after giving his pedigree in the presence of Warden Lewis E. Laws, was placed in cell 7. Later, he ate the regular death house mess, an omelet, mashed potatoes, muffins, and coffee, the $2.43 taken from him being hardly enough to squander the first night, although he does not drink or smoke and consequently would not be hoarding it for cigarettes. County Judge Lewis J. Smith sentenced Crowley to die without comment in the crowded Mineola courtroom after denying the motion of Two Guns counsel Charles R. Weeks for a new trial. June 3rd, 1931. The kid who used to say, "Now I lay me," at his mother's knee, sat facing her yesterday from a witness chair, mumbling a story that caused her to avert her eyes and frequently to bow her head. He had traveled a long way from her knee. He was telling how it happens he is charged with the murder of Virginia Brannon, his taxi dancer sweetheart. Just a guy who wanted to be a big-time Charlie. That was Rudolph C. Duringer. Wanted to go stepping. Wanted to be a hero with the girls. Wanted to show Virginia how tough he was. Wanted parties. Wanted booze. Wanted joyrides. So he got a couple of gats and started sticking up drugstores to get money. Me and Two Gun Crowley. As he recited his story before Supreme Court Justice Albert Cohn in the Bronx, there listened his mother and his father and the parents of Virginia Brannon. Both occupied front benches by the rail, the Duringers on the right side of the room and the Brannons on the left. Duringer, the comic, whom the fellows in Ossining called Fatty Arbuckle, he was that funny, wedged his 220-pound hulk into the witness chair early yesterday morning and remained there all day. But he wasn't the hard, tough hombre Virginia and Mildred Moore knew. His voice was almost inaudible, and he stammered often as District Attorney Charles B. McLaughlin prodded him with questions. He sat hunched in the chair, shoulders slumped, mopping his brow repeatedly with a handkerchief he carried in his right hand. For yesterday, Fatty Duringer was trying to squirm out of the electric chair by repudiating a signed confession he had made to the police and McLaughlin. No, Fatty hadn't shot Virginia because she said she was going to marry another fella. It was like this. They were riding in the car after a lot of drinks from the Half-Pints, and he was asleep, and all of a sudden Virginia punched him and said, "Let's go have some excitement." So Fatty had pulled the .32 Colt from his pocket and fired a bullet through the floor of the car. He was about to shoot again when Virginia tried to seize the gun, and it was discharged, the bullet entering her side. "It was accidental, all accidental," said Fatty, wiping the perspiration from his brow. Said McLaughlin, "Then you were lying when you made your confession at the time of your arrest." Fatty nodded. "Why?" "Crowley told me to." Crowley told him to do everything. Crowley was to blame for him having the 2 guns. Just packing them around for Crowley. Crowley led the stick-ups. Crowley stole the Chrysler they were riding in the night Virginia was killed. Crowley told him where to take the body. Why, the night they shot it out with the cops, it was Crowley who did the shooting. Fatty threw his 2 guns out the window. And McLaughlin asked, "And you crawled under the bed, too, didn't you?" "No," replied Fatty. Fatty, when Virginia cried, "I'm shot," wanted to drive to the nearest hospital. He begged Crowley to do it, but Crowley wouldn't. Instead, Crowley drove to St. John's Seminary, and Fatty dragged Virginia from the car feet first and tossed her over the 4-foot wall. Fatty wasn't even drinking when that happened. "Just excited, but not drunk," said Fatty, and mopped his brow again. June 4th, 1931. Rudolph Fat Duringer's blonde face lost some of its anxiety early today as the hours clicked by and a Bronx County court jury still squabbled in an anteroom, unable to reach a decision as to his fate. Beads of perspiration, provoked by dread when the jury left the courtroom, dried on his forehead, and at times he appeared almost to doze. At 1:30 a.m., the jurors had been out for 8.5 hours. Duringer, who had sweated in fear and had babbled questions about the likelihood of his burning to his counsel in the first hours of the long wait, had gotten hold of his nerves before the jury returned at 1:38 a.m. He stood up stolidly to hear the verdict, his face blank. He appeared not to understand exactly what was going on. Before the verdict was announced, court officers led an uncle and aunt of Duringer's into the corridor. Before the verdict was announced, court officers led an uncle and aunt of Duringer's into the corridor, but a woman cousin remained and sobbed while the jury was being polled. There was no demonstration, and the formalities were quickly over. Duringer went through the ordeal of giving his pedigree to the police, speaking mechanically in a hoarse whisper. When that ended, he was taken back to his cell. Rudolph Fats Duringer, Ossining truck driver who shot his dime-a-dance sweetheart Virginia Brannon, will join his pal Two-Gun Crowley in the Sing Sing Death House early next week to await his turn in the chair. December 11th, 1931. The state of New York last night marked the 26th birthday of Rudolph Fat Duringer by sending the portly young Ossining truckman to his death in Sing Sing's electric chair. As the lethal current shot through his veins, the pal of Francis Two-Gun Crowley paid his debt in full for the drunken murder of his sweetheart, Virginia Brannon, dime-a-dance hostess. He entered the chamber at 11:30 p.m. and was pronounced dead at 11:08. The condemned man went to his doom almost in a trance. As he passed down the one-way street a few minutes after the clock struck 11, his eyes appeared riveted to the floor. Beside him walked the Reverend Anthony H. Peterson, Protestant chaplain. Not a sound came from his lips as death house attendants proceeded to strap him into the chair, adjust the electrodes where the trousers had been slit, and to fix the death cap. The executioner turned on the current. 5 minutes after Duringer entered the chamber, he was pronounced dead. The sphinx-like state in which he walked to his doom contrasted with his manner of the early evening. He collapsed into a sobbing wreck when word seeped into the pre-execution chamber that Acting Governor Herbert H. Lehman had refused to exercise executive clemency. As the night wore on and the hour of his doom approached, he appeared to brace up. Before being led from the death house to the pre-execution chamber, he shook hands with 23 other condemned men, including his pal Crowley. Here was a startling contrast. Crowley, about to die next month for the murder of a Nassau policeman, was sardonic. Duringer wept. His 260 pounds, he gained 40 pounds while in prison awaiting execution, quivered as if with the ague. The diminutive two-gun began kidding. "I'm in a great spot," said the cop killer. "I got half the dinner." He referred to Duringer's act in sending him half his last meal, a repast that included roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and ice cream. Duringer had been able to swallow only a few mouthfuls. Earlier in the day, the condemned youth's mother, Mrs. Anna Duringer, went to Albany intent on making a personal plea to Lehman, but she collapsed en route. She returned to Ossining and was admitted to the presence of her son an hour before the execution. They kissed goodbye, but no words passed between them. January 22nd, 1932. Francis Two-Gun Crowley was electrocuted in Sing Sing last night. He tried to die as, for the most part of his 20 years, he had lived, scornful of the law. But the sneer on his face softened as he entered the death chamber, and the grin with which he emphasized a joking last-minute remark to his guards faded. He remembered his mother then. He spoke lovingly of her. His nasal tenor voice softened to an almost reverent whisper. "Tell my mother I love her," he said as the buckles were being fastened about him. "Tell her I appreciate everything she did for me." He paused to watch the last operation of the guards. "Then, my last wish is to send my love to my mother." His voice was steady. His nerve had held. At 11:01, the current was turned on. 4 minutes later, he was dead. He carried to the chair with him a 15-inch crucifix, the gift of Father John P. McCaffrey, who walked beside him as he trudged the last mile from the cell to the execution chamber. On the other side was Principal Keeper John J. Sheehy. Earlier in the day, Crowley, keeping up his air of bravado, had profanely scorned spiritual aid. He was still acting the part of Two-Gun, the ruthless slayer who killed cops and gloated over it. But in the death chamber, with the drone of Father McCaffrey's recital of the litany for the dying ringing in his ears, he clung tightly to the crucifix. He had quit being the actor. He became then a kid about to die. He looked the kid, too, in his gray prison trousers and white shirt. The chair seemed to swallow his puny frame, a frame that had, until then, housed only hatred and self-adoration. He watched closely as the guards strove to adjust the electrode to his right leg. Then, grinning, he suggested to Principal Keeper Sheehy, "I don't think that lower one is tight enough, PK." It was, however, for it served its purpose while 2 charges, each of 2 minutes' duration, coursed through his body. But before they had, Crowley had glanced bravely around the room, smiling at the 35 witnesses. His eye encountered Sergeant John Lyons of the prison personnel. "Okay, Sarge," he rang out. "Hello, Crowley," replied Lyons. The mask was adjusted over his face. The straps were buckled across his chest, arms, and legs. The keepers stepped back. "My last wish is to send my love to my mother." Crowley's voice came through the mask. It was his last thought. Executioner Robert Elliott threw the switch, and the process of taking Crowley's life for the life he took, that of Patrolman Frederick Hirsch of the Nassau County Police, began. It lasted 4 minutes. His body was taken to the autopsy room. At 3 a.m. it was removed and taken to the undertaking parlors at 1777 3rd Avenue, from which it will be removed to Calvary Cemetery tomorrow for burial. It will be claimed by the mother of whom he spoke, his foster mother, Mrs. Anna Crowley, who reared him after his own mother had disowned him. It is doubtful that Helen Walsh, the sweetie whom Crowley spurned because she went out with a cop, will attend the funeral. Mrs. Crowley and members of her family are not friendly to the girl, even though she stood by him throughout the police siege in his hideaway apartment that preceded his capture. After taking leave of his foster mother and 8 members of her family at 9 o'clock, Crowley asked to see Warden Lewis E. Laws. They shook hands. The warden sent Crowley a quart of ice cream as a farewell gift. The youth shared this with Ruth Brown, a woman inmate who is awaiting execution for a murder in Manhattan. Warden Laws, who is convalescing from a broken arm, did not attend the execution, but was represented by his secretary, Clement Furling. Crowley's foster mother and the members of her family who accompanied her to the death house took their leave of the doomed youth at 9 o'clock. All the women were screaming and hysterical and had to be assisted from the prison by their escorts and by guards. At their departure, Crowley, who never quite matured mentally or physically and has been insanely proud of his handiwork with his guns, consented to receive Father John P. McCaffrey, the prison's Catholic chaplain. Earlier in the day, he had burst into torrents of profanity at the suggestion of church aid. The pint-sized murderer's ire was particularly aroused by the attempted visit of the Walsh girl, whose testimony at his Mineola trial helped speed him to his doom. "She's out. She's going around with the cop. I won't look at her," Crowley said to keepers when told Helen, armed with an order from Supreme Court Justice Joseph V. Morshauser, was waiting to see him. Then she left for the Palace restaurant, where she was snubbed by Mrs. Crowley and her daughter at a nearby table. Meanwhile, Two Gun ordered his last supper: roast turkey, salad, rye bread, ice cream, an orange, tea, and a package of chewing gum. At noon he had a repast which led guards to remark that it should kill him if the chair didn't. It consisted of a T-bone steak, mashed potatoes, salad, rye bread, gelatin pudding, bananas, chocolate almonds, tea, milk, and cream soda. He also ordered a box of cigars, which he passed out among friendly keepers and fellow inmates of the death house, and a box of candy for Mrs. Crowley. Asked about his refusal to see the Walsh girl, Crowley said, "I'm okay. I feel fine. I'm going game. I don't want to see her. All I want to see is my family. The father, who left his mother before his birth and who is a private detective, was believed somewhere in New York City. What his feelings are toward the love child he never cared to know have never been ascertained, but those of the immigrant girl who is Crowley's flesh and blood mother are known. Visited in her home in a village in Long Island recently, the woman, whose name is withheld, said, "Why should I wreck my happy home for that boy? I am married to a man who's been very good to me, but who is the type who might, and very probably would, kill me if he knew my past. I was a young immigrant servant working for a New York family 21 years ago when the father of this boy, who was a son in the family I worked for, seduced me. I was discharged from the family and he deserted me, and I was forced to get another job and board out the infant to Mrs. Crowley. I didn't bring him up, and I'm not responsible for the wreck he made of his life. If it would do any good, I might consider going to him or asking the governor, but about all it would do would be to wreck the lives of myself, my husband, and my 3 lawful children whom I love." Unquote. The woman was frigid as she said this several weeks ago, but of recent days, friends have reported her as acting sad for some reason, and yesterday, a set of rosary beads, enclosed with an apparently tear-stained piece of paper inscribed Mother, was mailed to Crowley from New York. That was The Taxi Dancer's Death Ride, a Broadway Moth, her overweight date, and the Half-Pint Gangster, called from the historic pages of the New York Daily News and other newspapers of the era. True Crime Historian is a creation of Popular Media. Check us out at www.popular.com and hear our other podcasts, Portals to Possibility, an improvised mock talk show that proves you don't have to be human to be good people, and Catastrophic Calamities, exploring the famous and forgotten disasters of the 19th and 20th centuries. What could go wrong? Everything. Some listeners choose to support this podcast by signing up for a premium account on Himalaya, the official podcast player of True Crime Historian, where you can get the first month free by using the promotional code HISTORIAN when you check out. Some listeners choose to support this podcast by checking in at the Safe House at www.patreon.com/truecrimehistorian to get early access, exclusive content, and whatever personal services you require. Opening theme by Joy. Some music and sound effects licensed from podcastmusic.com. Closing theme by Dave Sams and Rachel Schott, engineered by David Hish at 3rd Street Music. Media management by Sean R. Miller-Jones. And as for me, wanted parties, wanted booze, wanted joyrides. I'm True Crime Historian Richard O. Jones, signing off for now.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com.